Linda Warren Seeley, and I went to law school in Memphis, Tennessee at the University of Memphis, which was called Memphis State University at the time. And I had been born and raised pretty much in Texas, which is where my parents were from. And my dad got a job that moved him into management, kind of moved us around. So we moved up north, and it was very different living up north from being raised in Texas. And I was the odd girl out, very unusual. My first real exposure to a significant number of minority people. I had known some Hispanic folks, but very few. And ended up kind of getting caught up in some of the racial strife that was going on in New Jersey and then again in Chicago, which is where I went to high school. And just felt that I needed to, as I made decisions about what my future would be, that I really wanted to work in a field where I was an advocate for people. I'd always thought I'd be a teacher. I started out as a special ed major and thought, no, I can do something bigger than this. And ended up in law school. And when I was in law school, I worked for Legal Services. At the time, they had filed a fairly big class action on behalf of Medicaid recipients. So my first foray into actual practice of law was in a big class action lawsuit, kind of got caught up in it. When I graduated from law school, I was still at Memphis Legal Services, and at that time, President Reagan had been elected. He hated legal services and was bound and determined that he was going to do everything he could to get rid of the program. And so there were a lot of cuts going on. And at that time, the National Legal Aid Office made a political decision that they were going to require field programs to set aside and use 12.5% of the total grant funds that they got on what they call private attorney involvement programs. And since Linda was the new kid on the block and nobody really knew what that meant, they said, you do this. And so what basically my first job out of law school was recruiting attorneys to do pro bono work for legal services. And it was a brand new idea in Memphis in the sense that there had never been a structured program. And so basically I just was kind of thrown out there and started doing it. Well, we had some pretty good successes, but it wasn't the practice of law, at least not for me. And I made the decision after about a year that I would go into private practice. And I did. We did some housing discrimination work in federal court. I started having children, and I felt like, well, I really don't want to be working full time and have these kids, so I cut back to part time. And after about 5 years, the executive director at Legal Services called and said, look, we need your skill set back. Can you come home, come back to us? And so I did. And from like 1990 to 1996, I worked at Memphis Legal Services again, recruiting and training volunteer attorneys and, setting up CLE programs, creating different projects for them to work on, like the one that you saw upstairs, the Saturday Legal Clinic. During the course of that time, I divorced my children's dad, met my current husband, married him. He came to Memphis from Jackson, Tennessee, which is about 100 miles away. And he said, I really don't like practicing in Memphis. Memphis is a really tough town to practice in. I'm used to rural practice where your handshake is your word, where you're, very much a gentleman attorney. There's not all of this formal discovery and going into court and fighting. And that was really kind of what you learned in Memphis. I mean, you were at each other's throats on a lot of different issues. So he said, I'm going to open a private practice up in Jackson. And I'll commute from Memphis to Jackson. And then eventually you can come practice with me, because it's a lot easier to practice in a rural area. People trust each other and they like each other, and it's not so formal. And right as he was doing that, the executive director of the legal aid office in Jackson, out of nowhere, just out of the blue, called and said, look, I need somebody to come run my pro bono program. Will you do it? And sometimes God or your higher power, or whatever you choose to call it, puts things in your path and you just don't say no to it. So my children and myself and my husband moved up to Jackson, Tennessee, and my main job was, again, to recruit and train attorneys to do pro bono work for legal aid. After 8 years in Jackson, the Memphis program called and said, we need your skill set back in Memphis because we have no more pro bono programs since you've been gone, and we really do need somebody to reinvigorate what we do. So now I'm commuting from Memphis to Jackson, and in the interim, through all of this, I've been very active with various bar associations. I was the president of the statewide Women's Bar Association. I became a mediator. My husband's practice became fairly successful, and I own part of that. It's called Divorce Incorporated, and I do mediations in addition to my full-time job. When I was in private practice, I did a lot of domestic relations work, and I guess about 5 or 6 years into it, I did a divorce where I represented the husband who was at fault. He had done some things that, caused his wife to no longer trust him, and they had like 3 kids. And in the course of doing this divorce, I was kind of a jerk, and I didn't like it. I didn't like being a jerk. I didn't like the things that I felt like I had to do to be a zealous advocate. And it was really at that point I started evolving in my thinking about, how do I really want to do this for people? Is there a better way? And that's when I started looking at mediation, started thinking, how can I be a different person as an attorney? And of course, at that point, I'm starting to have children. I'm thinking, is that what I want for my children? Is that how I want to raise them? I'm not that kind of mom, with my kids. Why is it appropriate for me to do that when I'm dealing with other people who are in pain just because their interests might differ from my clients? So I got the mediation certificate, started doing those things, started talking to people about law school and what was going on there, and met some of the women attorneys who, here in Memphis, we put together the Lawyers as Peacemakers, Lawyers as Problem Solvers conference about a year ago, and really kind of started opening up to the whole idea of a different practice of law. Well, again, all of these streams of one's life tend to come together as a river. And while I'm raising children and watching them grow, and trying to grow as a parent and as an attorney and as a wife in a second marriage, my faith starts to evolve. It's always a churchgoer. You're raised and it's what you do and that kind of thing. But really, I guess what I saw was that there were so many things that the faith-based community was doing that was good, but because of politics, the good that the faith-based community was doing was ignored in favor of looking at maybe other issues. And my daughter and I have been on a number of mission trips, down to help people who were victims of Katrina, and right now she's on a mission trip with the church. She's gone up to a place called Camp Barnabas to work with developmentally disabled children. And my son, who graduated from college, his job is he works at youth villages with, juveniles. So, I mean, our family values and what we believe are in being helpers